Greetings, folks. Welcome to another one of our Free Friday community classes right here on the YouTubes. This week, we are digging into a plant that my group over on Patreon just finished doing a month-long journey with. And the medicine, the magic, the green gnosis, the revelation was for real. So I'm really excited to be sharing just the tip of this particular plant, just a little sprout, because pine goes really deep, and all of the content that we shared this month was really beautiful. So, if you are new to thinking about pine and really, that whole concept of evergreen medicine, hopefully we will get you excited about it with this class. So, let us get started. Here's where we're going to go today. Talk a little bit about etymology because I get nerdy about that kind of stuff, a little bit about botany, and then we're going to cover just some of the medicine and some of the folkloric and revealed magical aspects of pine. And then we will wrap up with some shares with some of my personal experiences with connecting to and working with this incredible tree. So the name pine, interestingly, comes from the reconstructed Proto-Indo-European for pit, which probably translates to resin. Of course, nobody in the modern world speaks the Proto-Indo-European dialect anymore, but enough of our extant languages are children of that parent language that we're able to reconstruct all kinds of words, and one of them being pit. So we believe, or rather etymologists believe, that the common name pine comes from this very ancient Proto-Indo-European word for resin. And you can see in the slide here this beautiful resin, fragrant resin on the pine tree. Now, we've only really been using the word pine to describe these particular trees since about the 19th century. Previous to that, fir was the more commonly used name. The problem being is that fir is a very specific, but botanically speaking anyway, fir is a very specific type of evergreen tree. So we can look back to Old Norse and see fura, Middle English fura, Danish fyr, Norwegian fura, Dutch Vuren, and German Fura, right? So all of these etymologically sound pretty much the same, and they speak to a more ancient name for pine trees, which is, like our common FIR, fir, but that is now a specific tree. So we've kind of reverted back to an even older name for this tree, which is pine, back to the Indo-European. So, a bit about botany. First, the genus of Pinus or Pinus has about 180 species. It's a really, really big genus, and one that when I take folks out on herb walks and foraging and gathering expeditions, pine is one that actually comes up a lot that people are confused about because there's a lot of misinformation online, as per usual. And people get concerned about working with pine, thinking that some of them are toxic or some of them will, harm you in some way, and realizing how many species there are to navigate. And generally, if you are in part of the world where pine grows, lots of different pines grow, right? There's never just one species of pine where someone lives. There's usually a lot. So identification is important. Pine trees are monoecious, meaning that the male and female reproductive organs of the tree are both on the same tree, right? One reproductive expression. And the cones of pine trees generally have a female cone which produces seeds and a male cone which produces pollen. And so what happens is the wind kicks up, or animals come in and out of the pine boughs and they shake the pollen out of the pollen cones, and that pollen then moves over to the seed cones where those seeds are fertilized and turn into the actual pine seeds. The cones, once they've been fertilized, they release those viable seeds via really interesting triggers. So sometimes it's environmental changes, like the humidity will change or the temperature will change, and it will cause those closed cones to open up and release the seeds. Sometimes it's a forest fire or lightning strike or any number, certain amount of precipitation of rain. So these trees are very, very smart. They are really plugged into cycle and flow, and they can help us do that too, as to when is an appropriate time to send out those viable seeds and to, create something new. What's good timing? The leaves, which we call needles, they are botanically speaking, they are leaves, but they're needle leaves, have a waxy coating on them. And this waxy coating sort of slows down transpiration. So it helps the plant, the tree, maintain more of its moisture, more of its vital fluids, more of its essential and volatile oils. And this is one of the ways that evergreens stay green during the winter, is that they are sort of self-preserving. They coat themselves in this wax that allows them to, bundle up and survive the coldness, and it makes them very, very hardy. That wax coating, as well as really deep root systems and their ability to conserve energy and fluids during the winter, is what makes them evergreens and what makes them some of the longest living trees on the planet. They can survive windstorms and forest fires and earthquakes and all kinds of other things, lots of diseases that other trees can't survive, because they're very tough and resilient. So, another thing that I think is important to consider or meditate on botanically with pine is their importance within like a broader ecosystem of plant people. So, first of all, their canopies provide shelter and home to countless numbers of animals, and they really are a favored tree for critters to live in because they're kind of spiky, so critters will feel safe and protected when they're in there, and they're very clean, and they are very high. And again, when the wind blows, animals are less likely to have their nests or their burrows destroyed, right, in those situations. And they're smart enough to know that if you can secure yourself a spot in a pine tree, you are much more protected and much safer. The litter from pine trees, so as they shed their needles and shed bits of bark and resins and all of that, and that falls down to the forest floor, uh, that becomes very rich, very harmonized, very strong, fertile soil. So they are a big part of how forest floor soil is so incredibly nutrient dense and so fertile. And uh, they really add to the whole nourishment of wild spaces, not only by making the soil richer, but also by their seeds. They provide a food source to a lot of animals through parts of the year when other plants and trees are not producing very much. So the pine tree really keeps a lot of wild animals alive, which is very cool. So let's talk a wee bit about medicine. So first, when I think about working with pine medicinally, based on where I am, I think about Weymouth, Scots, Eastern White, and Red. Again, there are 180 species of pine, and I would not necessarily consider all of them wholesale medicinal, or safe for use in the ways that we're going to talk about today. So please be mindful of that and really take the time to confidently identify the type of pine that you're working with. Uh, if you have access to Greaves Modern Herbal, she lists out a really exhaustive list of the types of pine, the species of pines that have been historically worked with in a safe way. So that's always a good one. And you can always just do internet searches online to see if folks are working with particular pines in your area. But generally, especially in the States and even in big parts of the UK, Weymouth, Scots, Eastern White, and Red, like one of those pines will be one of the native pines where you live. So you just have to find them out. So here's a fun one because I love when traditions don't clearly agree on the deeper energetics and temperaments of a plant, right? I think part of that is cultural. I think part of it is microclimate. I think part of it is how those various cultures approach and work with that plant and sort of what personality the plant shows. So we see in traditional Chinese herbalism, traditional Chinese medicine, that the pines are generally seen as bitter warm. And if you know much about TCM, you know that this combination is very, very rare. Most bitter herbs, most herbs with an active bitter alkaloid, which we love, right? I can't get enough of bitters, are cold or cooling. This is why bitter herbs uh, are often the ones that we turn to during pyretic or inflammatory or infectious states because they're very cooling to the tissues. But here we have an example of a plant that is bitter and warm, which beyond the scope of this class, but has its own depth of magic that's really worth meditating on. And then Paul Sadir says that, and this is really the primary source that I used in writing my monograph for the plant spirit journey with pine, uh, because there weren't any other ones that I, really felt had a good depth of information. Paul Sadir said that pine is cold and wet. So we have a very different perspective here of this particular tree. Um, don't let stuff like this. I'll do a little sidebar here because I think people get hung up on this kind of stuff. Don't let my spiritual experience of a plant that contrasts with yours mean that I'm wrong or you're wrong. Don't let TCM's experience of a plant contrasting with, Sadir's French vitalist perspective or whatever mean that TCM is wrong or that Western vitalist traditions are wrong or that he's wrong, right? Remember that energetics are just a language. They're symbols that we use to try to engage with the wisdom of nature. They are words, right? Just like I'm using right now that imply deeper truths. And so different people can approach the same truth and use different language to explain it and connect with it. And all of it's valid, right? Like there's definitely wrong stuff out there. We see that on social media a lot, people just spouting stuff that's just wrong. But when we see these ancestral traditions handed down over time, the empirical evidence is there. They've proven themselves. Otherwise, we wouldn't keep talking about it. And uh, it's a fun meditation for me when, for example, if TCM, if Shendong Pansao and Atharva Veda and, something Cole Pepper wrote all about a similar plant, all disagree. um, to me, that speaks more to the complexity of that plant spirit's temperament and personality, and more to the way that the person of a plant can show different sides of themselves based on bioregion or climate or the way that a particular culture is approaching that plant, than it means, oh, uh, this materia medica is wrong because Shen said this, right? It's not that cut and dry. So, sidebar over. General actions of pine rubefacient, meaning that the volatile oils, that really terpene and turpentiny smelling volatile oils in pine are kind of irritating to the tissues. This tree is incredibly antiseptic, diuretic, antiviral, expectorant, and alterative. And we are working specifically with the needles here. Resin, cones, wood knots, lots of different parts of pine are used medicinally in different traditions, but for the sake of this class, we're keeping it needles, right? Um, Pine is an incredibly strong medicine. So even when you have, 100% confidence that you're working with a white pine or Weymouth pine, I still don't like people to just jump in and take a dropper full of a pine tincture, right? Ease into it. There's a lot of complexity. This tree has been around for a very long time. Sometimes one, two, three drops, like a drop dose of pine, is all the body needs, and sometimes all the body can handle. So ease in very slowly. This is a really safe herb generally, but needs to be respected, right? And you'll notice when we get into the formulary here in a minute, I don't do tincture with pine. I have other things that I like to do. So just be mindful. And when in doubt, start small, one drop, listen to your body, see what feels right. Okay. So I would say that the seat of pine is in the respiratory system, and you will see that in some of these virtues and these connections, that pine has a deep affinity with the upper respiratory system. So I work with pine a lot for upper respiratory infections when we're seeing heat, when we're seeing discharge, when we're seeing the mucus actually collecting infected material and trying to cough it out. We're seeing color in the phlegm. I think about pine for cough and cold. I want pine needle tea. I want steams. I want all the things which we'll talk about in a second. I even work with pine a lot for pneumonia and bronchitis. I know that says bornictis, but it's bronchitis. Pneumonia and bronchitis. There needs to be other herbs in a formulation with pine, but pine is oftentimes one of the staple herbs that I work with for those, deeper respiratory tissue infections. Then fungus. People pick up toenail fungus, foot fungus, sometimes fungal stuff on the scalp, or fungal stuff on the skin that sometimes is totally normal but's annoying to people. Uh, this is a really, really beautiful herb, and I think that one of the things that pine does in the forest, which we'll talk about here in a second, is maintains an interesting relationship with fungi, with mushrooms, right? Uh, I also consider pine to be systemically antibacterial. So in a pinch, I might bring pine tea or a pine steam into a bacterial infection. Uh, Generally, I think about pine for the respiratory system specifically, though. Uh, if I didn't have any other plant to work with and somebody had an infection somewhere else, maybe I would bring pine in, but it would not be my first choice outside of the lungs. So, two ways to work with this plant that I really like. One is through respiratory steam. So this is you're taking, a big fistful of dried pine needles, you're throwing them into a pot of simmering water. I'm also going to throw in some mullein, hyssop, horehound, and a tiny little bit of thyme. And you're covering that and simmering it for like 5 to 10 minutes, really getting the plants to open up. And then you take that hot pot of boiling water or simmering water over to a nice stable surface like a tabletop, or you set it on the floor, and then you use a towel or blanket to tent yourself over that steaming pot, and you inhale through the nose up into your upper sinuses, upper respiratory, and you inhale through the mouth, across your throat, across your palate, down into your lungs, and then back and forth a few times, and then you come out of the tent and you maybe blow your nose or give yourself a couple good coughs, and you kind of give yourself a minute to regulate, and then you go back in. You do that 2 or 3 times per day, right? So respiratory steams with pine, very, very powerful. And when it comes to fungal stuff on the skin, I think about making an oil infused beeswax balm with usnea lichen and a little bit of oregano. Very, very effective. You could also do concentrated pine tea soaks. So you're making just a really strong pine needle herbal tea, basically, and then soaking the feet, or doing a poultice with that tea onto the part of the skin where there's fungal. You'd probably have to do that frequently, which could be annoying, and you would need to make sure that the skin is allowed to fully dry out before you go put your socks on and kind of lock that moisture in, which would defeat the purpose. So I prefer a drier beeswax balm for that. And then, of course, not on here, but there's always an invitation to throw a few pine needles into your wintertime teas, into your respiratory teas, into your cold and flu teas. You don't need a lot, but even just one little bundle of needles, like the graphic here, just toss that in and get some of those needles in there. Get some of that beautiful pine medicine. So we talk a bit about the magic now. Both Cunningham and Paul Sadier agree that pine is connected with the element of earth, so stability, fortitude, and a lot of the deity traditions where we see pine come up, and I'm going to tell you a story here on the next slide, include Pan, Dionysus, Attis, the Green Man, or Vridios, and Cybele, Venus as well. So, a couple of the ways that I work with pine on the more energetic, magico energetic, ritualistic level is first and foremost for purification. Pine has that bright, astringent, antiviral, antiseptic, antibacterial energy. This is the kind of plant that we want to be smoldering in our homes, in our spaces to purify. If you've ever had the pleasure of standing in a copse of pine trees, the air is always pure and crisp and has this fragrance that is like the most clean scent, right? This is why I think we make pine the fragrance of so many of our cleaning products because it reminds us of that like cleanliness of pine. So instead of burning toxic incenses, rolled chemical dipped incenses, or working with plants that are threatened or endangered or that are part of closed practices for other traditions or cultures, everybody's got access to pine. So you can harvest some pine ethically, in the right way, and dry that pine out and burn a few needles in a little, incense dish or something, and let that scent move through and cleanse and purify. I also think about pine boughs for sweeping. So doing a ritual sweeping or a cleanse. You can use the pine bough like a broom, and you're not necessarily trying to sweep up dust off the floor. You don't even need to touch the floor. It's more that the pine is being used to sweep out energetic patterns, right? Sweeping up uh, energies and patterns that have been laid down that you don't like. Similarly, we can use pine boughs to sweep a person, to sweep somebody's energy field to help purify and cleanse them. So that's very good. The cones in a lot of traditions, are considered to be symbols of fertility or fecundity. We see them carved into the ends of priapic wands in Western traditions. So you can keep the cones around for fertility of all kinds, not just physical fertility, but creative fertility, all of that. Think about forest bathing is really rooted in pine culture, right? That this concept of going out and being with pine trees, uh, you will be inhaling the terpenes, you will be inhaling the volatile and essential oils, especially when you go out at certain times of day when the sun warms those leaves. And it changes you, right? It's impossible to be in those spaces inhaling that medicine, seeing the sunlight pass through the needles and creating that chlorophyll green color, being grounded in the earth, being around these ancient and wise plant spirits without getting a little bit of an adjustment, right? Even if you walk through it very unconsciously, people come out of those spaces saying that they feel less pain, they feel less sadness, they feel like the thing they were angry about is gone, they feel revitalized and rejuvenated and more spiritually harmonized. Um, who doesn't want that? There's a lot of folklore, especially from European traditions, about copses of pine, like the one shown here on the slide, being like nature's cathedral, that when you are surrounded by pine trees, you are in a space that is otherworldly, right? It has this air of sanctity, of spirituality, of liminality. And so there are many, many bits of folklore and belief that prayers said, in a grove of pine trees, or meditations done, or offerings made in these pine spaces are many, many times more effective because you are surrounded by beings who uh, will not only add power and depth to whatever you're doing, but part of their spirit is that they create a sacred space. They create the nematon, right? The church within the woods. So consider that. As I mentioned earlier, there's also an interesting connection between pine and mushrooms. And in this case, Amanita muscaria. Oftentimes we find Amanita growing in the pine litter at the base of pine trees. So pine and Amanita have really interesting relationship with each other. A bit beyond the scope here, but you know, let me mention Christmas, right? Yuletide. That two of the most established symbols are evergreens, pine trees, and the Amanita red and white mushroom. So, very deep connection here, to the extent that I think folks who work with Amanita on a spiritual level, there's a real invitation there to purify and protect yourself with pine and then do the journey work with Amanita. And similarly, working with pine and Amanita together, there's a potentating effect. What the chemistry of that is, I'm not sure, but it's something I've experienced, and it's something that the pine themselves have taught me. So there you go. Uh, we also see pine pop up mythologically in a lot of the dying and rising god motifs, right? This we see all over the world. Every ancient culture has it. It's so repeatable that it's one of the things that we can be the most confident about when it comes to human spirituality. We see consistently a concept of a mother goddess, an earth goddess, or a mother nature figure who has a son or lover or partner that is the god of nature, the wild god. And he's generally a dying and rising god, which means that part of his personality, part of his play is that he dies and is resurrected every year as part of the yearly change of the seasons, right? And one of my favorite iterations of that is the one of Cibele and Attis. So here there's a stele of Cibele on the far left with her tympanum, her drum, and her lion. And next to her is the handsome Attis. And back in the day, Attis would be celebrated as the season shifted from the growing season into the not growing season, or from the bright half of the year to the dark half. It was understood that Attis had fallen, that his fertility, his power was no longer with the land, and that he had retreated. And so members of his cultic practices would take a pine tree, which was his symbol, and they would strip it of all the branches, and they would treat that sort of big pine log almost like his body, invoking his now wandering spirit into that pine tree, dressing it in funeral garb, in a burial shroud, and placing it in a tomb at the feet of Cibele's temple to rest over the winter. And then as the spring reemerged, Attis was seen as being given his life back, coming back to life, being resurrected, and that pine tree would be, with a lot of ceremony, would be removed from the temple and sometimes erected as an icon of him, a symbol of him for the year to come. And we see this again over and over and over and over again. But the Cibele and Attis myths are very important to me, and ones that have really informed a lot of what I do. So, last little bit here, I just want to share some of uh, the teachings that I've received from pine directly, or the spirit of pine. And first is, pine as a guardian of the dark half of the year, right? This makes a lot of sense, that pine remains green and even fragrant during the middle of winter. Here it is mid-January when I'm recording this, and all of the pine that we have here is still beautiful, covered in blankets of snow, but still very much alive, very much invested in our side of the hedge, where most other plants retreat down into their roots. They go into the other world, the world of the Fae. Pine stays here. They act as guardian. They keep watch so that our entire world doesn't die back. There's some representatives of the pine, of the green realm, the plant kingdom, holding it down here. And of course, there are others like ivy and yew and holly, but pine is exemplary as a protector during the dark half of the year. This is why we bring boughs of pine inside the house around Yuletide, right? To protect the home and to protect everyone in it. Nailing a pine bough to the door, or hanging a pine bough that you walk under as you come in and out of the house, uh, praying for the pine spirit to keep us safe during the dark half of the year. Pine is a great teacher of the mysteries of death and birth, because pine stays invested in our side of the hedge and watches the cycle over and over again, watches the life energy retreat down into the ground from whence it came and then rise back up at the allotted time. So I like for folks who have a lot of fear, a lot of perseveration around the mysteries of death and what comes after it, to work with pine. Pine settles the spirit around death, around the concepts of death, and even really lovely plant to work with when somebody is nearing or has passed. The scent of pine for me, and something that I've been taught by this tree, uh, when we are in an open hearted space, will gently move us into altered states of consciousness. It just makes us a little more perceptive. It kind of opens us up to the reality of the green realm, to the presence of plant spirits and other non physical, non human persons, and to the flows of nature. So, again, when we're in those sacred spaces of pine and we're inhaling those fragrances of that plant, it drops us into a meditative state or into a just a very light trance state where the work that we're there to do, even if it's just walking, right, even if it's just being in nature for a minute, is done more effectively. And because pine is one of the older living trees on the planet, has a ton of perspective. Whatever you have, whatever you're dealing with, whatever you're going through, whatever you're working on, pine has already seen it a lot of times. So you can take comfort in approaching pine with your stuff. They're a fantastic confessor, a really beautiful tree to just go talk about the things you're ashamed of or guilty of, things you want to do better, things you want to release. They're like a grandparent that way. They've seen it all, they've heard it all. You can't shock them, and they will listen. They have incredible perspectives on the ancient past. So when we want to um, see our lives from a greater angle than the one that we're in, right? To try to see what this moment looks like from the perspective of timelessness. Pine can be worked with to connect to the ancestors, to an ancestral stream, to our herbwise ancestors, or just to move back energetically through the timeline to connect to the roots of our practices and the roots of what we're doing. Pine has seen it all, been there for all of it, and they give this incredible, just it really is just a grandparent energy, like you're sitting with somebody who's incredibly old and wise and calm and loving, right? It's just that energy, and you're wrapped up in that sacred space of pine, which is always lovely. So just a few, just a tiny sprinkling of pine energy today, hopefully gets you excited. We do advanced classes every month, on demand courses, plant spirit journeys like the one we just did with Pine, guided meditations, and there's a vibrant community over on my Patreon. So if you want to dig deeper into this stuff, there's details down in the info below. And with that, I will send you out into the world to go find some pine trees to love, and I will see you next time. Take care.